All right, we are finally back with some pretty sizable beta changes to a lot of classes. So in this video, I'm going to go over all of the tank specializations and talk about what has really changed. Now, beta just came back up, so I have not had time to kind of like test any of these things out. So I will attempt to give a video later in the week kind of summing up how the tanks are feeling, probably once again, now that it's been a few weeks since I've looked at that. But let's get into everything that has changed across the board. So first things first, Blood Death Knight got a couple of touches on their Deathbringer hero talent to hopefully bring it up to where Sand Lane has been performing. So we are seeing Exterminate, Reaper's Mark, and Wave of Souls all seeing a 110% increase on that ability. So anyone who was particularly fond of the Deathbringer hero talent for Blood, but maybe has mostly been seeing people play Sand Lane, the damage just wasn't really there, and hopefully this helps it out a little bit. We're also seeing slight buff to blood on the Sand Lane tree as well. Vampiric Strike damage is going to be increased there. And then I think that pretty much sums it up for the BDK. So they're kind of getting it to the point where they are trying to fine tune the damage between the hero talent trees. I'd imagine that tuning hero talents is probably a massive headache, because not only are you trying to make sure that a tank is balanced in terms of its effective HPS, its ability to mitigate damage, and its damage across the board, that you're trying to compare to other tanks and now each hero talent individually. So we are starting to see that now. Blood has always felt, so far throughout alpha and beta testing, the tank that's been ahead of the pack in terms of where it's been placed in terms of performance. Now, of course, this last week we saw kind of a dip in its overall I guess performance when it comes to like damage and healing, mostly because they got some pretty significant nerfs, mostly due to them getting over buffed. But basically, I think the way that Blood is currently playing feels really fleshed out. It's just now, again, kind of tuning. So moving on, we also got some pretty sizable Demon Hunter changes as well. So Vengeance in the Annihilator tree is getting a damage increase to both, or I guess all three, Dark Matter, Voidfall Meteor, and World Killer. So World Killer is your capstone. Voidfall Meteor is kind of the original node when you first pick your hero talent, and then Dark Matter is one of kind of the tertiary effects as well. So those are all saying a 50% damage increase. Vengeance Annihilator compared to Aldraki has felt a little underwhelming in the damage compartment, so I feel like these changes should be good. Now, where things are getting weird is when we get down to the Vengeance abilities. Now, I'm going to have to dig a little bit deeper because I'm a little confused on what's going on here personally, but we are seeing an all ability damage aura nerf by 35%. So this is obviously alarming at first, thinking that, well, I've never felt like VDH was overperforming in the damage department, and this is a massive nerf. But as you start to read down, what this ends up doing is there was probably some type of aura buff that was added way in the past. They are removing that modifier. Now they are individually targeting specific abilities. That's how I'm picturing this. Maybe I'm wrong. Correct me if you know more than I do, because I'd hate to be giving wrong information. But basically what they've done is they feel like Fracture is maybe dealing too much damage compared to the other abilities in the kits. So when you look at something like the Aura nerf with the Fracture buff and the tier set change, it almost is probably going to equal out for the most part, but it is a slight nerf. They're also making it have an increased base cooldown, but it's also going to generate more fury. So I think the idea is that they want you hitting Fracture a little less, would be my guess. Now I'm interested to see how this is going to interact with the Annihilator tree, which wants you to Fracture very frequently to generate your Meteor stacks, your Voidfall stacks. So interested to keep an eye on that, but basically it should make the rotation feel a little less, I guess, bloated, because what ends up happening is because of, stacking haste and this being your main filler and generator, you are spamming Fracture frequently, but sometimes it feels like you can't get other abilities off when you should. So hopefully this will make the gameplay feel a little bit more fleshed out without taking away from its ability to generate resources. And then obviously we have a ton of buffs, hopefully to help compensate for the aura nerf that they implemented. So things like Immo aura being increased by 50%, Infernal Strike being increased by 50%. Now, I'd imagine that these aren't actually, this might be a little misleading, because if they're nerfing it all by 35%, but then it's a 50% increase on the new value, this might not necessarily be 50% of what it originally was. So I'm interested to see how these changes actually play out. But we're seeing an increase to everything from Infernal Strike to Sigil of Flame to Soul Cleave, Spirit Bomb, and Throw Glaive. And so I'll let the nerds figure out the math on this, and I'm going to end up just testing it and kind of figuring out how it feels compared to other tanks. But this is a pretty sizable tuning pass, I would say. Notably, they also nerfed the 4-set. This Explosion of Souls is doing like a significant portion of our overall, so getting a small nerf here isn't the end of the world. But it was like, for me, it was doing like give or take 8%, I think, give or take, yeah, maybe. So this is good. Moving on to Druid, nothing really was touched here. I think Druid's generally been in a pretty good spot, at least Druid of the Claw has been. They're actually buffing Rejuve, Regrowth, and Wild Growth for Guardian Druid. Kind of an interesting set of buffs here. Maybe to incentivize things like Convoke or potential off-healing through Heart of the Wild, but the only change that really matters here is Regrowth healing being increased, which is, again, really odd because their Regrowth through Drumus and Arius already feels crazy good. So, yeah, once again, this is going to be like a tested and see how it feels and why, but most of these don't really apply to the Guardian. I don't really have much to say about that. Same with Monk. Monk also got kind of the short end of the stick this week, which is expected. They got some pretty good changes last week. So what they've done is they've done like a Master of Harmony fix. I think most of this is actually in regard to Mistweaver specifically, where like Soothing Mist wasn't benefiting from Stratagem, and Sheilun's Gift and Vivify not withdrawing the Coalescence and Harmonic Surge. These obviously don't apply to the Brewmaster, so I think the only thing, there's pretty much nothing that actually is worthwhile mentioning here. Now, surprisingly, and also not surprisingly, Protection Paladin didn't, at least in these notes, isn't seeing any kind of significant change. What they're really addressing is a lot of the bugs, which potentially could be why Prop Paladin has been kind of down in the dirt the last entire beta cycle. So first off, Golden Valkyr, whenever you'd proc this, which is whenever you dip to a low health threshold, it would proc Guardian of Ancient Kings for free. Now, the problem that they've been having on PTR, or I guess this beta testing, is that if you had Guardian of Ancient Kings available as a cooldown and this procced, it would consume that charge. Very interesting bug, made it really complicated to use Guardian of Ancient Kings, because sometimes if you just dipped low at the start of a pull, it would immediately consume this, but it wouldn't give you the full duration of 8 seconds. It would only give you the 4-second duration. So that's a good change. They've also fixed an issue with Hammer of Wrath not correctly interacting with a plethora of different talents. So hopefully this helps as well. I didn't know about this, but I guess their new mastery was not properly, or at least having a really low rate of reflecting spells or blocking periodic harmful effects. I don't know how much of an impact this would have, but if it was in an extremely low rates, hopefully this getting buffed or fixed will help them survive. I'm trying to think of like how many damage events though are dot based, because that's essentially what this is, right? It's just blocking periodic damage. What kind of stands out the most there is that we're not seeing a lot of tuning. I'm surprised that we're not seeing like a lot of defensive tuning right now for Paladin, because that's where I feel like they're lacking the most. Now, admittedly, I haven't tested it a whole lot, but mostly because the class feels so bad to play. So I'm hoping we see some kind of adjustments in maybe the next build, but I'd like to see what their direction that they want to take with protection, and then be able to actually properly test it before the expansion comes out. So yeah, kind of laughable changes there in my opinion, but let's move down to Protection Warrior. Last but not least, they have adjusted a couple of things. Protection Warrior got a big kind of sweeping change last week where they've added some talents, moved some talents around, buffed almost everything across the board for them by like 100%. Overall, really brought them back up, I think, I would say on par very loosely, but on par with the rest of the tanks. This week, we're seeing some minor changes. So, for example, Thunderclap damage being increased, Rend also being increased once again on the initial damage. Shield Slam being reduced by 10%, feeling like they might be giving too much single target damage here. Also counting for like the Phalanx here, Apex talent could be a reason for this. Revenge is being increased by 50%, which is actually kind of surprising. And then the following talents have been removed, Bolster and Unnerving Focus. We knew this from last week. That's nothing new. Thunderblast also being increased by 20%, probably to reflect the same increase to Thunderclap to keep things consistent. And then finally, Tide of the Battle's Colossal Might increased Revenge by 3% per stack. It was 7. This basically meant that every stack all the way to 10, you'd have like a pretty sizable damage increase on Revenge. They've made it a little less dependent here. That's probably why we're seeing a revenge increase. So when you are playing Colossus, you aren't so dependent on these stacks or having your damage fluctuate drastically based on you consuming your Demolish stacks or your Colossus Might stacks with Demolish. Overall, though, those are all the changes that we're seeing. I'm pretty content with a lot of these. I think they're all still moving in a really good direction. I think Protection Paladin is still the tank that probably needs the most help currently. I think their defensive state is just really rough. Now, maybe it was because of all these bugs that they mentioned and they stated that they fixed. We'll have to see. I'm going to be spending probably a lot of time this week testing. Last week I got a little tied up in player housing, if I must admit. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know if I got anything incorrect or I missed anything that was impactful, and I will be testing all this week. Hopefully you guys are all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.